Thank you, Chris, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's always a fantastic event. However it starts, it's still going to be a brilliant day. And it's particularly interesting to be asked to talk on this provocative subject about whether modern life, how well it fits with our pets, how compatible it is with pet ownership. And I know we'll come on to some other topics for other species later on. And I've got the, again, slightly provocative title of where do pets fit into our busy lives. And already I think that's interesting in terms of how it's framed. So how do pets fit in with our lives, almost taking our lives as a given and making pets somehow fit into what we want on how we live our lives. So I'm going to slightly also touch on the question of how we can make that fit the other way round, how we can help improve pets' modern, not sure we'd say busy necessarily, lives. And in doing so, I'll use a general sort of welfare approach of looking at the inputs, the things that cause animals suffering or more positively enjoyment, and the outcomes of them in their physiology, their pathology, and their psychology and behaviour. And we'll talk about these different inputs in some degree of detail without this becoming a sort of diatribe about modern life. So let's start that. I think we're in a point we can certainly describe as a scientific age. There's been enormous advances over the last half-century in veterinary and animal welfare sciences. And of course, they've given us a wealth of guidance, a wealth of knowledge, some of which translates into laws. But with that very big positive, a few caveats are worth noting. First is animal welfare legislation isn't new. It sort of predates a lot of the more recent science. In fact, I think it was 3000 BC, the Code of Hammurabi gave advice to ancient Babylonian veterinarians. And the late Vedic Indian Ashoka king, again, came up with animal welfare laws. I think that predates the Bramble Committee. So we've had these legislations for some type of law for quite some time. It's not some new magic thing that we're somehow fantastic in having animal welfare legislation. It's fantastic whenever we get good legislation, but we shouldn't be too proud of ourselves. Secondly, there's a lag period. After the science finds a conclusion, it takes a while for it to be disseminated, for it to actually achieve the behaviour change. I think the length of time it's taken to ban unenriched battery cages would be a good example. People talk nowadays about the death of the expert, and as vets, I think we feel that perhaps slight lack of respect, that people are going to other sources of advice, some of which are great, some of which are less great. I don't know whether that is a change over time that much, or just like my gran always says, people were more polite to their elders when they were younger. It may just be how we perceive it, but it seems to be there. And I think it's also worth noting, with all this information at our disposal, well, people still don't understand their 5 welfare needs. The latest PAW report had, well, over time, it's been about 30 to 40% of people only who are familiar with the Animal Welfare Act, and somewhere between 25 and 35%, depending on species, who think they are very informed about their animals' 5 welfare needs. And bearing in mind people are responsible for the entirety of their animals' lives once they've got them, you would rather want them to be very informed. And of course, some forms of abuse or neglect are not really about ignorance. Science can't particularly help us know that it's wrong to stub out your cigarettes on a dog, or, to be honest, we don't particularly need science, I would say, to know that it's wrong to keep a rabbit in a tiny hutch on its own at the bottom of the garden. So this science is really helping us, but of course it's not a panacea. Also looking back, pet keeping is as old as history. Again, we've had pet keeping really since before records began. I think it was about 10,000 BC. We find a dog buried with a person who was buried, suggesting again that connectivity. I say I think because obviously it was 10,000 years ago, I wasn't there. I don't know if you know, Chris. I think what we've also seen in our sort of modern age is this security. We touch wood, we haven't had any major global wars for a while, and we do have a degree of affluence. So perhaps that gives people the security and the disposable income to have pets, particularly perhaps different pets. And one might also describe it as now it's acceptable to have affection for one's pets. We don't need to try and look all sort of hard-nosed and think of them merely as tools. We can talk about them in very loving ways. Of course, as I think we'll hear more about, that over-affection can cause problems such as hoarding and obesity or failure to provide euthanasia. And there's also a degree of variation. The social justice issues of discrepancy between poor and rich, that is very much a feature of modern life, mirrors onto, to some extent, what resources people have in order to look after their pets. But of course, there are also enormous variations in how much people will commit to those resources that they do have. Probably where this talk concept started was the idea of we all have these sort of busy urban lives. Again, we'll touch, I think, more on the fact that for some pets who enjoy or need human company, well, the absence of that human company may cause a problem because people are out at work. We also have often described as faster, unstable lives. So I think that's difficult perhaps if people are moving around, changing jobs, changing housing, for them to be able to commit. Whether they're committed psychologically, actually they don't know what their lives are going to be over time. And that speed maybe gives people less time to relax for themselves and less time to devote to looking after their pets. Again, it's hard to say how much that's modern. I'm sure if you were a medieval peasant or in a Victorian workhouse, you didn't have particularly much time for meditation, but it still does seem part of our lives that we're trying to, as we've said, fit pets into our busy lives. People also talk about the lack of personal connectivity, a big irony or paradox, really, about urban life, that people can be more lonely in a city. And then pets, companion animals, perhaps are slightly plugging that gap. And we'd also talk about pets in the context of urban life means you don't have so much contact with the animals in nature. Or in fact, for many people, the animals you do meet are ones you hate and try and kill, of pigeons, rats, foxes, and other urban wildlife. So perhaps pets are a substitute other, to use the sociology poor grammar. We also, of course, have that connectivity between germs and allergies that people will talk about, again, perhaps from urban living, leading to allergies to pets, which of course then affects how people react when they develop these allergies, how they look after or whether they keep their pets. Again, we can't get too hung up on the germ transmission between pets. It's important, but of course we're sharing, I think someone was coughing on cue, we're sharing more germs between ourselves. And actually I read the other day, I think about 2% of our microflora comes from our own feces. So apologies to anyone whose hand I shook this morning. And I think it's also worth noting on the flip side of this that for our pets, again, they are not interacting with what at some point in their ancestry would have been their natural ecological niches. Again, it's hard to unpick what the psychological impact of that is, but it is worth noting. And one caveat that we'll come back to is when we're talking about the idea of companionship being an antidote, I'll use the phrase later on, to some of these problems, to some extent that is conditional on pets being kept well. Again, we'll think about that as we talk and while you're not listening to me, and we'll come back to that at the end. Another feature of modern life is the interconnectivity. As you're about to have to submit your questions, well, obviously, I guess you'd have submitted your questions in an interconnected way by speaking, but we've got the whole digital world of marketplace, innovative, and social media platforms. At the same time, we're seeing this separation of human social groups, partly because of cities, but partly because people are more mobile. And again, part of this companionship, we may see this almost over-substitution if people are familiar with the, I think predominantly American, idea that pets are sort of furry babies and people talk about them and treat them as if they really are a substitute for their family unit. Of course, at the same time, we've got the globalisation of trade, so the globalisation of pet breeding, wild-caught animals being able to be moved from their native environment to others, and the products that we feed our pets, the welfare provenance in particular, is made more difficult to exercise consumer behaviour by the very complicated global logistics of animal products, let alone in pet food as a more general concept. A key point we'll all be very familiar with, access to information is, to one extent, I've just dropped a load of water, I'm trying not to spill it on the computer. Otherwise, we'll have very limited access to information, but the internet gives us this ability to access enormous wealth of information. But of course, it doesn't need me to point out to you, that gives people access to misinformation as well. I'm not sure whether it's the people who shout loudest, but it's certainly the people who blog at length and write on comments page in capital letters, I guess would be the equivalent, bless you, that get heard. And it's also worth pointing out that some of this interconnectivity gives additional opportunities or motivations for some forms of animal abuse. So this is a case from the neck nominate craze of a couple of years ago, where there were, I think, a couple where people swallowed goldfish as part of that. Again, part of that's new. It's got a new appearance that people can share that through social media. But again, the idea of eating live animals for effectively entertainment is not particularly new. Another feature, very hard to quantify whether this is more or less prevalent or severe than in the past. But certainly we talk about mental health, and it's very big in the media now, how we need to talk about it more and how we need to do more about it for mental health problems in people. So whether you'd call them mental health issues, they're certainly forms of mental suffering, such as loneliness and boredom, that we've touched on a little bit in the previous slides. And then as actual mental health conditions, such as depression and anxiety being key big ones. I think it's, from some stats, it's about 1 in 6 people in the UK would say they've experienced some such condition within the last week. That's a fairly significant amount of people. And we talk a bit, I'm not going to talk at length here, about how pets may both help prevent some of these conditions, partly for reasons we've touched on, but also perhaps that they may well be useful in the therapy for some of those conditions. And it's also worth thinking, well, how does this reflect on our mental health and the suffering of our pets? Again, I would argue you can make the similar claims, and I don't think I'm saying anything particularly controversial there. So loneliness, again, certainly for social, gregarious species we'll touch on. Boredom, again, I think a lack of enrichment. We might not normally call it boredom, but we try and sort of skirt round that, and I think that's essentially what we're talking about. Syndromes of depression and anxiety, again, there are experts here who can talk about in more detail. I think it's an interesting question to what point owners can either prevent or mitigate that mental suffering or health problems in animals. Certainly for dogs, there's an interesting question of the substitutability of companionship. But I'm not sure, in general, that owners manage to fill that gap for pets. I'm not sure they help provide what pets are lacking if we don't provide it in more natural, animal-based ways. So let's do a very quick comparison, if you like, of how we are modernly, that's not a word, is it? How we are nowadays, and how perhaps our pets are. So we've got key issues, obesity. Obesity is, of course, increasingly prevalent. I think in the US it's about 1/3 obese, 1/3 merely overweight, 1/3 neither. In the UK, I think it's about 1 in 4 people are obese. And worldwide, I think it's about 13% of people are obese, which is an astounding when you consider the variation across the world. And a sizable number of children, I think, again, about 1 in 6 in some Western countries. So that's a fantastically high problem for modern life. Again, people packed into the urban small compartments. We've got all the issues of pollutants that we're exposed to, not merely in urban environments. We've got social isolation and overcrowding at the same time. Behaviour-wise, well, arguably we've got a natural lack of natural resources. Again, I think it's very interesting to think as people to what extent our man-made things can substitute for our interactions with the environment. But certainly there's a lack of that natural resources for a large number of people, and I think a large number of children growing up. A lack of space, as we've talked about, both space to think and physical space. And there's variation, both less in this country perhaps with the NHS, but certainly worldwide, enormous variation in access to healthcare. And even in this country, some variation geographically, perhaps particularly to preventative and mental health care. It's perhaps a step too far on the trying to be edgy to talk about whether there's over-treatment of humans. But let's think about this for our pets. To not go through the whole list again, I'm sure you can notice that little has changed. And I'm also sure you can add to this list yourselves. So obesity, we'll can talk about by species in more detail. Dental problems, again, across a number of species, not least horses and rabbits and other and rodents. Again, small compartment size, the issues of pollution, that irony of both, we've got social isolation of some gregarious species and overcrowding of some less gregarious species, or even overcrowding of social species if they're incompatible or they haven't got the space or resources that they need. Again, similarly in behaviour, we've talked about in a bit more detail, and health, I think there's this variation. In the UK, I think more than any other country is extremely impressive in the amount of subsidised or free treatment that it provides for pets to obtain. But there still is a degree of variation, and particularly worldwide. And again, we have questions of over-treatment. That's the subject of another talk. So to conclude this sort of introduction before we get into some of the details, I think it's fair to say pets, I don't think it would be right to describe them as incompatible with modern life. In fact, I think for a large number of people, they are an essential and integral part of modern life. And it's hard to imagine our lives without them. In addition, arguably they can be the antidote to some of the problems of loneliness, of lack of connectivity, of lack of interaction, and some of the problems in order to obtain the therapy for that. So we can use, I'm not sure that's the right word, pets in order to help us ourselves cope with modern life. I think at the same time, there are some forms of pet keeping that are incompatible with some forms of modern life. We still need the commitment, you still need the time, you still need the resources to be able to look after the pets. And we talk a lot about helping people choose their pets in order to fit into their lives. At the same time, it's the clear flip side of that is that there are pets who cannot fit into various people's lives. And perhaps some pets, some species or some individual pets who would really struggle to fit into modern life in general, unless you happen to own a bit of a rainforest. What do we need to do then as recommendations from this? Well, we need to choose our pets carefully. We need to make sure that we're not merely using pets to help us cope with modern life problems caused by ourselves or our own social organisation. We need to make sure that those pets themselves can fit with those lives. Of course, we also need to make sure, this is a key aim for AWF, that we're educating owners directly and both as vets educating owners, making sure that people are able to understand how their lives are impacting the animals they keep. Thank you very much for listening to that introduction. We'll get on to, I think, the more interesting and useful and erudite and beautiful talks later on. But I'm happy to take any immediate questions.
Thank you, James. And I think we can all agree it's a great, challenging start to the day, and beautiful and erudite and informative. We always get a bit of history with James as well, and I do enjoy listening to him. I've got a question for you, James, actually, so we'll get them through Slido. If you can start asking your questions, that'd be fantastic. Do you think the concerns expressed extend to the non-traditional companion animals that we keep as pets as well?
So I think yes would be the very short answer. So clearly the interconnectivity of the world, I think, means that animals are being able to be transported. That's one of the issues with exotics, partly that they're being wild caught and then transported, but also that interconnectivity raises the profile of these animals, even if they're then captive bred. And of course, you would argue it takes a large number of generations to get them compatible with pet ownership in the sense of having the psychology to be able to cope. Dogs and cats and horses and goldfish have been domesticated for millennia. I think also the idea that people have access to some information, but arguably not enough information, is particularly pertinent to the non-traditional species. So people can see that there are others who keep raccoon dogs or reptiles of less. Again, it's hard to say what's the traditional species for reptiles, but not quite the access enough to get the information to work out whether they can look after those pets, or once they've got them, in order to work out how to look after them properly. So absolutely it really focuses on that. What it shouldn't be is a distraction from thinking, actually, those same questions do need to apply to our considerations of dogs, cats, rabbits, horses.
Thank you. And another question coming through. Do you think that the age range that people own pets affects their relationship with their pets? So an increasing older population, do you think that's having any effect on the relationship with the pets and the problems that we might be seeing?
So it probably depends on which features. So again, I know some of the statistics suggest that older people may have more access, well, may have more time. They're not potentially going to work if they're retired, for example. Well, I know some retirees in this room are still very busy. So on some of the levels such as that, clearly that's going to be an issue. Again, nowadays in this country, probably older people have more disposable income than they would have done in the past. So in order to have the resources to look after their pets, I think in some anecdotal cases, it still becomes problematic, in particularly for older people to access veterinary treatment would be one example. Actually, that becomes very, very difficult for them.
Thank you. And to what level should we be encouraging owners to choose pets that actually fit their lifestyle rather than one that they may wish to own? So, as much as we can would be the short answer to that, I guess. The difficulty, of course, is the lack of access we have to when people are making those decisions. You know, generally we as vets or charities, we are presented with that too late, and people don't want to give them back, and I'm not sure we want to encourage that sort of disposability as you would any other market commodity. And then, of course, the other problem is the motivation of people. So you can inform people about how much things will cost, about the resources needed, but if people have this mental image that their perfect family involves a spaniel, it's very hard to disabuse them of that. It's also interesting, having had fairly recently a young child, I don't think we did any research into how much time or money that was going to cost. So again, the motivation just pushes through. It's going to be hard to know how much it does that. As an aside, my wife did an awful lot of finding out other information, and I think the access to misinformation point comes through very strongly on babies too. Thank you. And do you think there's ever a point at which we have this concern around the pet is doing the owner good, but perhaps the owner isn't doing the pet good, and should there be any intervention at that point?
So it's hard to think, again, what that intervention would be beyond what we all know about trying to make people make their pets' lives better. But I think there is that question of thinking, right, how do pets fit into our lives? What do they give us? And also, how can we mitigate some of the problems, such as leaving them alone if they need that company, or the fact that children are looking after the pets and you need to make sure that there's additional oversight by the adults. So I think we very much look at it that way. I think one can go too far and become very sort of flag wavy and almost saying, right, we shouldn't have any pets. It's an exploitation. It's a form of animal abuse in general. Absolutely, that's that's too far in the other way. It's forming that middle ground of saying, okay, where is this mutually compatible? And I think this is where, actually, especially coming from a charity sector, is quite helpful, because we do think of them as matching in some ways. You are trying to think, well, how does the pet enrich the owner's life, recognising they may be well placed to judge that, and vice versa. So it's more like adopting a child or finding a life partner than it is about procuring something to improve your life.
I suppose that topic has come through, actually, is now starting to come through in the question of, is owning a pet a right or a privilege? And if you don't have the resources, time, space, etc., should you be able to have one because you need one, want one, desire one? And on top of that, do we have sort of examples that are inappropriate choices, and is it right to give examples of inappropriate choices?
So I think there are some cases where, candidly, I would say they're always inappropriate choices, such as probably some primates. To give a nice, probably a bit less controversial example. Again, unless you do own that bit of rainforest, it's hard to think how having a monkey is going to fit in with your busy modern life. I think we generally say, one might say that rights they're not unlimited rights. I think people have a right in the sense of nobody should necessarily say they rather than somebody else shouldn't have a pet, but the right itself is limited by the ability to look after that pet. It's not an unlimited right to have any animal in any conditions, in any way you like, just as the same. I wouldn't want there necessarily to be police on whether people can breed themselves, but absolutely that right is constrained by doing it correctly, by doing it with the interests of the child at heart. And sometimes people need to step in, not to curtail the right itself, but to say, actually, you were outside of where the right you had. The right you had is to have a pet or to have a child and look after them properly. If you're not doing that, then we can step in, because that's not your right.
Thank you. And do you think this is a new issue? I know you've touched on it a bit on history, but do you think there's always been a potential discord between human lives and animal lives, but potentially as we've got to the modern day, we're choosing different pets and we have more pets and it's more highlighted?
I think it's, again, historically, that was one of the interesting bits of thinking, well, what of what I'm talking about is actually part of modern life, and what of it is merely just part of interactions with animals or pet keeping generally. I think some of the fundamentals, that there will be people who don't care enough or know enough, versus other people who really love their pets and look after them very well, and then other people perhaps who, I don't like the phrase of care too much, but emotionally find it difficult to make some of the responsible decisions that need to be made. That presumably has been always there. And again, it's really hard looking back to look at the history of pet keeping as pet keeping. Of course, we've had dogs and cats around for ages, and plausibly at some point, and in many cases even up till now, they're functional tools in some way for catching rodents or for hunting or for other purposes, or part of a commercial activity of breeding. But I think there's always been, or as far as we can look back, some element of that affection. And even if, and they're not mutually exclusive, even if you're using an animal, you can still have affection for them. I mean, a lot of people who have guide dogs, right, will still love them equally as much as people who aren't using them in that way. They're not mutually incompatible. So I think that strain has always been there.